Hello, I'm Jasmine, and I'd just like to ask you guys to introduce yourselves and tell us why you're interested in political philosophy.
Hi, I'm James Humphries. I'm a lecturer in the philosophy department, mainly in political philosophy. Why I'm interested in political philosophy, I mean, I'm sorry to do this so early on. Let me give you a multi-step answer. So firstly, as some of you will know, I've always been sort of fairly politically minded, so when I started doing philosophy, it was sort of inevitably the political stuff that most grabbed my interest. The other reasons are, there was a guy a few years back who's now sadly died, called Dudley Knowles, who was, apart from being a really, really nice chap, he was the first person I'd met in academia who seemed to take at least non-liberal political philosophy seriously, right? So it's like, actually, I think the communists might have a point, right? The anarchists might have a point. And that seemed kind of exciting, because otherwise there's a lot of just assumptions about what sort of things are sensible in political philosophy. And Dudley was the first lecturer I had who sort of took the non-liberal critique seriously. The other reason is when I was in my final year of my undergraduate, I was on a liberalism course taught by I forget who. And I remember thinking, this is all really interesting, incredibly well worked out stuff, but I think is entirely wrong. So then I did what everyone who's got a high opinion of their own brain decides to do, which is like, I'm going to go into philosophy and make it all correct. And that's more or less how I've ended up here.
Yeah, well, hopefully we get the correct answers by the end of it. So, what about you, Ben?
Yeah, so I'm Ben Colburn. I've taught philosophy here in Glasgow for 13 years now. James was in my first undergraduate class at the university quite a long time back. I'm mostly a political philosopher, although I also spend quite a lot of my time at the moment doing medical ethics for kind of policy-based reasons. I mean, there are two ways to answer the question, why political philosophy? The boring historical way is that I wanted to be a philosopher of maths, but the right master's supervisor was not available at the time because he was on leave. So I went for my second choice, who was a political philosopher, and ended up falling in love with that part of the subject and sticking with that. But there is a better answer to that, which is that political philosophy is really, really hard, and that makes it quite exciting. It's much harder than metaphysics or logic or something like that, which is a slightly curious thing to say, because of course actually the reading those other parts of philosophy can be really difficult. But I think that what's interesting about political philosophy is that it's something, as James says, which touches on our political action, touches on things that we're all absolutely familiar with. So the concepts and the ideas and the concerns of political philosophy are the sorts of things you can get into really quickly and easily. And working out how to tackle those things with integrity and intelligence and with the skills of philosophy in a way to make genuine progress, that's really hard. Really steep learning curve at that point. You get into it easily and then the difficulty ramps up tremendously. Whereas once you've understood what the questions are in some of the other areas of philosophy, I think it becomes a bit more straightforward. So it's because it's difficult and exciting in that way, I think I found myself hooked on it for, well, many years and counting now.
Awesome. I hope we can get the answers with integrity and try and get through it in that way.
Excellent. So obviously today's panel event is focused on political philosophy's autonomy. So to kind of start us off, what is the basic idea of autonomy, or the naive conception when we first start looking at autonomy?
Sure. So I think the basic idea is that autonomy is about living a life in some sense of your own. It's about your life being the way that it is because you've made it that way, to a greater or lesser extent. I mean, no one in the sort of discipline thinks that everyone can be maximally autonomous at all times. It's sort of a goal that we're aiming for. But I mean, the core idea that drives it is that there is something important, and what's important about it, we can and do argue about. There's something important about being the person who is, to a large extent, kind of in control of your life. So it should be up to you, whether or not you make good decisions, and we frequently don't, but that there is some value to being the person who decides how your life goes, rather than having everything set up for you, even if, as it turns out, having everything set up for you would be kind of good for your welfare, which some people think is the case. Does that sound right to you, Ben?
Yeah. Nothing to add to that. Seems correct.
So you've sort of already touched on it, but then why is autonomy important, particularly if you are in the sort of school of thought where you think that we are never fully autonomous? Why do we want to be autonomous?
have a couple of thoughts on that, I guess. So, I mean, there's a straightforward answer, which is that it's remarkable within at least sort of English language or European-derived philosophy how often this idea crops up of the value of setting the rules for yourself, being sort of self-governing perhaps, or having some measure of control over your life. We can understand what that means in various different ways. We'll be getting onto the disagreements you can have about how to understand that. But it's funny how there is convergence on the idea that something in that space is important. But it's interesting that you sort of talk, Jasmine, about how we think that autonomy is valuable. I mean, it's increasingly interesting to me to ask the question, well, who's the we that we're talking about there? Because in some ways, I think autonomy is not a central ethical notion out with that cultural context. It's not something that crops up in Far Eastern thought very much, for example. And on the one hand, I think this sort of pushes us into a kind of cultural relativism. It makes us wonder whether autonomy is a sort of culturally specific value. Could still be a value if it's culturally specific, of course, but one might think that it's sort of culturally specific. I tend to think not, actually. I think there are ways of reflecting on the dissent that people show from autonomy, which suggests that it's important, and that it's important because it's central to everybody's conception of a good life in some way. But it is disputed, and actually disputed even within a kind of context like ours, I think. There's this really infuriating book. It was one of my philosophical development moments that's a bit like the one that James described, where he was being taught about liberalism thoughts. Obviously wrong, I have to just prove that it's wrong. There's a book by Stephen Wall, which was published in 1998, and it's about the value of autonomy and its relationship with liberal neutrality and things of that sort. And the only argument that he gives for autonomy being valuable is a little thought experiment where he says, suppose that we ask somebody whether they would like us to take over their life and make all of their decisions for them. If we reassure them that we know we have all of their interests at heart, we're extremely wise, we understand all of the relevant psychological and sociological science that would allow us to make good judgments. Suppose that I'm like that, thought those. Would you want to give control of your life over to me? And Wall says, obviously, the answer is no. And the fact that the answer is no, and that we answer no, shows that we all have this fundamental belief that individual autonomy is valuable. Now, I pick the holes in that argument at various stages where it goes along, but I thought, well, he's asserted that we answer this question in this way, but, I mean, do we? So actually, I broke off away from my PhD research at that point and just went and wandered around the university for a couple of days asking people those questions, seeing what they said. And even there, that is to say, even in a university town in sort of early 21st century Europe, people were equivocal about that. It's not, lots of people said, well, actually, if you really know what's best for me, I'm kind of happy to hand over to you. So I don't know. I think that autonomy has a kind of value, but it's a kind of value that's not captured by the fact that we all desire it. It actually, I think, doesn't really centrally feature in many people's conceptions of what's important for them at all. We have to kind of get at it obliquely. Might get the opportunity to expand on that a little bit later, but I think that's as much as I've got to say just now.
Would you agree with me?
To some extent. I'm horrified to discover that you've been going doing X-Fi, that's a bad start, and experimental philosophy, which thinks you can get...
Before it became a thing.
Yeah, the questions of philosophy is like asking someone. No, so I agree with, certainly I agree with the kind of note of caution about who this we is, particularly given the historical features of who it is that does analyse it, can find philosophy. But I want to take a slightly more autonomy fundamentalist approach to this and kind of bang the table and go, no, it really is important, it really is valuable. And the reason why I think is at bottom to do with agency. And so agency, roughly that agents, like the sorts of beings that we are, they make choices. And they don't just respond to stimuli. Now, of course, I've just assumed that hard determinism isn't true. I've just assumed that we are in fact capable of making choices, that not everything was just kind of set from the moment that the Big Bang happened. But park that incredibly controversial assumption. I think that we have to think that making choices is important. And it's just in virtue of the kind of beings that we are, I think, we're sort of doomed to be the sorts of things that have to make choices. That being so, I think it follows that we should maximise the realms in which we're able to make choices, that we should kind of with, I suppose, some worries about stuff like coercive offers that we might be able to get to later on. It makes sense to me if we think of making choices important, if we think of kind of acting on the world rather than just being kind of buffeted by the slings and arrows. If we think that's something that's important, and I think we're kind of committed to thinking that's important, then I think we're committed to saying that being in control of your life to a greater or lesser extent is also important, because being in control of your life is one kind of really, really it's almost the kind of the most basic kind of agency that you can have. And it's the kind of the thing that connects lots and lots of other uses of agency. Now, of course, if you don't think agency is important, then all of that just kind of falls flat on its face. But in that case, I've got a very complicated Kantian story to tell you, but I think we probably don't want to get into that just now.
So just to quickly clarify, is it almost as if you feel that autonomy has sort of like an instrumental value and yours more intrinsic value? Is that a mischaracterization?
I think that's a reasonable interpretation of what I've said so far, that actually, as it happens, in the end I come down to the sort of position really that James has just articulated. I think it has central intrinsic value for some reasons that are sort of Kantian in the way that I think James was alluding to. And in fact, I think here's a central reason to think so. I think that's the right response to this situation of cultural difference that I was alluding to earlier. I mean, on the one hand, I was articulating this worry that the fact that people conscientiously disagree about the value of autonomy is something that puts pressure on the idea that it's valuable. That in itself, I think, gives us a reason to think that autonomy is ultimately the thing that we care about. Well, why is that? It's because this disagreement, this conscientious disagreement, we feel commands respect in some way. The fact that somebody comes up to us and says, well, look, I don't really believe that autonomy matters, or I think that you've got this ethnocentric conception of value that's embodied in your advocacy for this. Well, what do we do when somebody dissents in that kind of way? Either we sort of take it, either we ignore that disagreement and just say, okay, fine, but actually autonomy is centrally important anyway, or we take seriously what they're saying. But the reason we take seriously what they're saying is because we take them seriously, we take seriously their perspective on what is valuable in the world. When somebody tells us that they come to the conclusion that something is valuable but not another thing, that requires a certain kind of response from us. It changes what we're allowed to do to them and not to do to them. Which is to say, you just get back to autonomy. So the very fact that we take this kind of opposition and we treat this cultural difference in the way that we do, I think, is a powerful reason to think that underpinning it is a sort of commitment to autonomy, especially in the context of moral disagreement. So as it happens, no. As it happens, I think that I am persuaded that autonomy has a kind of deep intrinsic value as well. It's just that I think that you get to it by reflecting on and taking really seriously these points of disagreement.
So obviously the autonomy debate is a very live one with a lot of people writing books and papers on it. Why is there such interest in autonomy for philosophers, and is it as important to those outside of academia?
So I think that's another two-part question. So for philosophers, I mean, there's a facetious answer, which is that, as Chris has rightly said, we like to play made-up word chess, and this is just a lovely new realm in which we can play made-up word chess and see who's got the goodest words. But I think, and this is to sort of touch on something that Ben mentioned earlier, actually, I think one of the reasons that it's so interesting for certainly political philosophy, but as we'll get to later on, it comes up elsewhere in philosophy as well. One of the reasons is that autonomy and concern for autonomy and kind of interactions between autonomy and other values, they sort of cover an awful lot of live questions in philosophy. So they cover kind of questions about education, they cover questions about healthcare, they cover questions about sort of dealing with things like end of life and kind of euthanasia. They cover questions about intimate relationships. They cover questions about the legitimacy of the state. Right? So I think autonomy is partly, I think, because it's such a broad value, it gets you into a lot of debates. Right? And kind of once a philosopher has been dragged into a debate, either they say, actually, this debate's based on a misconception, or they go, well, now I'm going to show how I'm right about this. So I think it's of interest to philosophers because I think it's such a kind of It's a value that lies behind a lot of other debates that we have in political philosophy. It's a value that lies behind a lot of debates about justice. It's a value that lies behind a lot of debates about obligation. Right? So partly, I think, because we've got this, I'm knackered now, I'm not saying we, but that's scare quote here, because we have this kind of commitment to some notion of autonomy broadly understood. Then it turns out that how precisely you think about that notion of autonomy is going to affect your answer to a lot of other very important questions. And so if you've got to answer kind of 20 questions at once, you don't want to be starting from the position of having the wrong view of autonomy. So that at least partly addresses why philosophers are so interested in autonomy. And before I go into the second part, does that sound about right to you? Got anything to add?
Yeah, nothing to add. I think I've been thinking mostly about why it has the role that it does have with the academy, actually. So
Well, in that case, why don't you take the second question?
okay, that sounds good. Yeah, it's a concept. I think it is a concept that people think about a lot outside academic philosophy, and I think that's actually problematic. I think it has this sort of. It's a little bit like a talisman that gets invoked in practical contexts, especially medical contexts, without people really understanding what's going on. So here's a sort of, let's describe it a little bit uncharitably. Whenever you're trying to work out what to do in medical ethics, the first thing you do is you reach for this textbook of medical ethics called Beauchamp and Childress, which just tells you that the principles are beneficence, non-malevolence, justice, and autonomy. What justice means is completely vague in this context. Malevolence and beneficence, so not wanting somebody ill and intending somebody's benefit, is all very well, but in a context where what counts as meaning ill to somebody and benefit doesn't give you any guidance. So autonomy is the thing they always come back to, without being specific about what it means, but using the word autonomy as a way of arguing in favour of or against a particular medical intervention. Has this weight because the term has this sort of Kantian imprimatur to it. That is to say, because the modern usage of the word autonomy comes from the moral philosophy of Immanuel Kant, and Kant is the sort of the most august and intimidating of philosophers. The thought is, well, look, I mean, what can we do better to rubber stamp what we're doing here with sort of intellectual seriousness than to use this word? Of course, the problem is that the word might look like it's infinitely malleable, because if you don't have a particular conception of what the content is, all you're really doing is trying to harness these sort of exalted connotations to allow you to do what you want to do anyway. So I think that that's the reason that it's so prevalent in medical contexts, is that people are really confused about how we should behave towards each other in those contexts. And the reassuringly Kantian flavour of autonomy allows them to feel like they're answering those questions in a principled way without actually doing so. Now, some people think this means that we should just drop the notion of autonomy entirely in those contexts. Honora O'Neill, who I think is probably the most eminent person who's written about Kantian autonomy, who's alive at the moment, Honora O'Neill gave this sort of absolutely excoriating lecture where she described autonomy as the emperor's new clothes. That is, once we actually see that there's no way of connecting that sort of variegated usage of medical ethics with anything that's genuinely Kantian, we should just think that all of this is rubbish, throw it away, find other concepts instead. I don't think she's right about that. I think there are other ways that we can reconstruct the foundations of thinking about autonomy in these practical contexts. But I think she's right about pathology. I think she's right that the reason that people use it in those practical contexts is the fact that it allows them to get away without thinking very hard.
So I had a brief. I think we might also think, and this just to sort of go back to why should people kind of out with the ivory tower care about it? Why do people care about it? And the medical ethics one is really, really useful actually, because and as much as I'm an incredibly bad patient, but I think one of the reasons that people do care about autonomy in medical ethics is that quite a lot of the time, when you're in the hospital, you've got really, really serious lack of control, right? You're sort of more or less told, here's what you should do, and if the doctor's not kind of incompetent, then you probably should in terms of your health. But that kind of having that control taken away from you is really horrifying, right? Anyone who's ever spent the night in cells would say the same thing, right? Kind of lacking control over your hour-to-hour, day-to-day life is a really, really awful thing. And this is a bit of kind of charitable read, right? to get the charitable route, that's partly why autonomy matters so much, kind of particularly in medical ethics, because it's quite often a time where, for the person who's kind of going on in life, you really lack autonomy, right? And although I agree with Ben, slightly clumsily lifted kind of Kantian version of autonomy that medics seem to usually work with, I don't think is the appropriate one for that context. And you can see why people are concerned about it. You can see why it's become a kind of something of a shibboleth in medical ethics, because it's a period of our lives where we quite often really seriously lack autonomy. And although how much we do lack autonomy might also depend on what view of autonomy you have, which is why it's important to have the growth, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. I think the hidden premise in O'Neill's argument, and also the hidden premise in medical practice around this, is that something has to be grounded in the work of Kant to be correct, and of course that's not always true. But no, I completely agree with you. In fact, I was at a workshop at the end of last week in London looking at the ethics around the spaces of birth, so thinking about design principles, in fact, for maternity suites, hospitals, home birthing arrangements and things of that sort. And what we were doing largely was just talking to people who have given birth and talking to obstetricians and midwives. And it's clear that there are these horror stories that crop up again and again about how badly wrong things can go when somebody is completely disempowered in that type of context, where suddenly they don't have control over how their life is going. It's clear that these are moments of enormous vulnerability, and that in that vulnerability, the thing people really want to hold on to is a measure of control and authorship of what happens to them in these kinds of moments. So yes, I think it's urgent. That probably also explains why people talk about it so much, but the Kantian-derived notion, I think, is the wrong one to mention.
Thank you. So we've kind of talked about autonomy in a big sort of umbrella term, but every now and then different types have come up. So we know there's sort of moral, political, personal autonomy. Can you tell us what exactly these are, and like why people are interested in them, what's worth investigating about them? I know we briefly touched on it, but anything else to add?
So I think when people talk about moral autonomy, we can back and forth between this. When people talk about moral autonomy, normally that signals that they're talking specifically about the technical motion from Kant. So Kant developed this very elaborate metaethical story whereby he addressed the question of why it might be that morality was binding, by positing that the human agent has this capacity to act on the basis of laws that it gives to itself. It matters to do that because for Kant there's this kind of virtuous circle of concepts like freedom of the will, acting morally, acting autonomously, acting in accordance with duty and reason, and so on. The moral agent, according to Kant, is the one who acts freely, but acts in a way which is acting freely means not just avoiding being determined by alien causes, because otherwise you could avoid doing that by just acting randomly. He said, well, look, somebody who's just acting randomly isn't acting freely. It must be the result of acting on the basis of a particular subset of causes, a particular kind of determining factor that determines your conduct. Which is to say, if it's not external things and it's not nothing at all, it's got to be you, it's got to be laws that you give to yourself. So for Kant, in order to be a moral agent, you have to have autonomy. You have to be the type of thing that is capable of giving laws to yourself, which you're then able to act on. If you do that, you're free. You're also acting rationally, because the only laws that have the particular qualities that make it possible for you to do that are things that are given to you by pure reason, because those are the things that are accessible to anybody no matter their circumstances. And you also in that way act morally. So moral autonomy, I think, has this technical notion, technical character that comes from the role it plays in Kant's ethical theory, in that it's the thing that explains why, despite being determined in other ways, we are capable of acting freely and morally in this sort of highly stylized way that he described it.
Yeah, no, I don't know. I think so. You do sometimes see autonomy get used, or moral autonomy rather, get used in a non-Kantian sense. I don't know if you remember this. There's a sort of several months period of my PhD where I was trying to write about this. So it started as a footnote and then kind of metastasized into about 10 pages. And then finally Ben went, "What are you doing? Why are you doing this? Please stop." But yeah, I think so. Sometimes it doesn't use in a kind of non-Kantian sense, and there I think it pretty much just means being kind of responsible moral reasoning. Right? So kind of thinking for yourself what the right thing to do is, kind of not blindly kind of doing what you're told, and not thinking kind of wantonly or flagrantly about it. And it does sometimes get used in that fashion. I think really that non-Kantian moral autonomy is just being a responsible moral agent. Yeah, I think otherwise it's almost invariably what Ben says. It's kind of acting on that maxim through which you can at the same time, etc., etc. With regards to political and personal, this is going to be slightly troublesome because I think they're the same thing. But my understanding of how political autonomy is generally used is that it's something along the lines of being able to take part in or kind of influence the political life of your community. And then, of course, you go, what makes something the political life? And I go, I don't believe it anyway. But broadly, kind of having some say over having some kind of part responsibility for the norms and the laws that kind of govern public life. Also, I think that you might be able to get a kind of scope or direction of duties distinction between political autonomy and personal autonomy. I'm not sure about it, but I think where I've seen political autonomy used, it tends to mean this sets of political rights, essentially, being able to have some influence over the kind of government, however that be constituted, okay, however broadly we're understanding government, over the kind of the government that sets the laws you live under. Does that sound about right to you?
Yeah, I mean, the classic example of this is John Rawls, the big 20th century political philosopher who talks a bit about political autonomy, and what he means by that is basically somebody who has this set of rights and duties that he thinks is constitutive of being a citizen. So it's not the starting point of an argument, it's the conclusion of an argument. He argues throughout his work that people ought to be treated certain ways, that we have certain obligations to each other, that we should have certain freedoms, that we should be equal in certain important respects. And political autonomy is the sort of label he gives to the kind of agent that you get if you've got those arrangements in place and you think those things are important. Sometimes you get it described in other ways. I mean, sometimes it can be treated as a sort of subset of being personally autonomous. Personal autonomy is this ideal of the kind of life we want somebody to lead, or the type of person or agent we think it's important for them to be. Sometimes people use the phrase political autonomy to mean whichever bit of that has to do with interaction with structures of power and other people. But I think it's clear that personal autonomy is the concept that's central really to the types of debates that I guess both James and I are engaged in, especially if you don't construe that phrase personal autonomy as being sort of in contrast to political autonomy, if you like. You don't have to think that there's a sharp divide between the personal and the political to think that personal autonomy is the central notion.
So they do intersect enough for it to be not too blurry, but
yeah,
that's where the fun debate is, I guess.
Precisely. In a way that depends upon your background, I think.
Yes. So I mean, I think this is partly why I don't think you can really separate out political and personal autonomy. So people sort of think of personal autonomy as being the kind of life of one's own stuff, and then as Ben said, political autonomy is something to do with interacting with power structures. And I think inevitably there's a very, very kind of low scale kind of power structure going on here, right? I think that kind of in order to be able to live a life of one's own, except in really weird edge cases, you're going to need to be able to have some say over the kind of norms or laws or rules or whatever of your community. In order to interact with power structures, you're going to have to interact with people at some point as well. So I think that there's we might usefully be able to go, this is the sort of thing that we call political autonomy. It tends to be more concerned with X, Y, or Z, and personal autonomy tends to be more concerned with A, B, or C. But yeah, then either we just call it personal political autonomy, or we think of political autonomy as being a kind of subset of personal autonomy.
Excellent. Now we're a bit deeper into the time frame than what I realised, so I'm going to jump a few questions and miss out 5 and 6 and go straight into the 7th one. So starting with Ben, what is your specific view of autonomy? What would you argue makes a person autonomous on a personal level?
Okay, good question. So remember, the core idea is being self-governing, and that we understand what it means to be self-governing in different ways. On my view, somebody is being self-governing or self-government is a quality of a life as a whole rather than of a person at a particular time. Somebody is autonomous, on my view, when they decide for themselves what is valuable and they live their life in accordance with that decision. So that involves two broad components. Part of that is internal. Part of that has to do with what's going on in your mind, what's going on in your brain. It requires that you settle on some plans of life for yourself. You decide what is valuable, in other words. It also requires that you do so in ways that are independent, in the sense that there isn't an explanation for the decision you made which is kept hidden from you. So it has to be the case not only that you endorse some particular forms of life, ambitions, values, goals, that sort of thing, but also that the explanation for those endorsements is something which wouldn't cause you to repudiate it if you became aware of it. So that's what deciding for yourself is. Roughly speaking, sort of picking your own ambition, picking your own goal, your own pattern or standard of what counts as a good life. And also living your life in accordance with that decision. So some views of autonomy think it's sufficient just to sort of be uninfluenced in your head, for you to decide upon these things, for you to have values that haven't been manipulated by other people. I don't think that. I think that the properly autonomous life is one which is successfully lived in pursuit of those goals that you've settled for yourself. I think you have a life of impaired autonomy to the extent that you don't get to make your life go in that way. So the autonomous life is one where the individual has worked out what makes for the pattern of success in that life. It's also a life in which the life lives up to that pattern, so you live the type of life that you want. If you don't do that, then you're not autonomous. But also it has to be you that has made it so. So the classic example of a life that's not like this is the life in the film The Truman Show, which once upon a time was part of the... once upon a time it was recent enough that I could rely upon everybody having seen it. I was using it as an example. I can't do that anymore, but I've got lots of nods, so I'm assuming that lots of people have seen it. So Truman, in some sense, lives a life that he's decided for himself what's valuable. It's sort of suburban activities like keeping his lawn mowed and performing his sort of job in the way that he does. And his life actually goes like that. But unbeknownst to him, at least at the start of the film, sorry if there's anybody who hasn't seen it, spoiler here. At the start of the film, at least, he lives his life in that way successfully because of the benevolent external management of the production company. He's, unbeknownst to him, the star of this reality TV show, where the reason that his life goes the way it does is because it's orchestrated entirely by somebody else. The people he interacts with are all actors. The reason his garden works well is not because his efforts lead to his plants growing in the way that he wants. It's because somebody comes in each night and makes sure that his sort of cat-handed attempts at gardening don't destroy them. They do that. Of course, he discovers this and it makes him unhappy, but we can imagine Truman not ever discovering that there's anything untoward or sort of behind the scenes about his life. And yet we would still say that he doesn't live a life of autonomy because he hasn't made his life that way. And it's central, I think it seems to me the most distinctive part of my way of thinking about autonomy to insist on that relationship between a person and their life, that it has to be the life they value because of them making it that way. That is to say, bearing various relations of responsibility to the way that their life goes. So for me, responsibility is absolutely central to autonomy. I think that's what I want to say.
I think this might be a case where kind of we get definition by contrast, because in a lot of cases, Ben and I will have more or less the same verdict on whether or not someone's autonomous. I think that what it is to be autonomous is to be powerful and to be authoritative over the direction of your life. That is to say, you're more or less able to decide how your life goes. If you decide where you're going to apply for jobs, you decide whether or not you're going to be in a relationship, and so on and so forth. And also, that you do this and that you have this power because you're seen as the appropriate person to make that decision, and because you're taken as being the agent who gets to make the final decision on at least lots of parts of their lives. I mean, there's going to be questions about when your actions concern someone else, like you don't kind of unilaterally get to say, I'm doing this, therefore this is the good life. But I think the authority condition will explain sort of partly why I would agree with Ben that Truman isn't autonomous, because he's not seen as the person to make those decisions, right? And it's kind of the decisions are being made in such a fashion as to kind of maximise ratings or whatever, right? But the distinctive part is, although I think there's internal conditions, so I think you have to be able to kind of make decisions, you can't be brainwashed and so on and so forth. think the second part is that I can see autonomy as being constituted by your relational standing, which is a bit technical, but basically just means that someone's autonomous status isn't solely a matter of have they decided that they want to do this and can they do it. Rather, it's a matter of whether they're kind of socially situated, right? So kind of they're within at least state organisations, their kind of legal rights, their civil rights, their economic rights, so on and so forth. That this standing is such that if they change their mind, they will be, without too much difficulty, able to change their life in the way that they want. So I don't know if Michelle actually does call it a counterfactual condition, but I think she should. So it's a counterfactual condition, right? And if I was to try and do Y rather than X, would I be able to do so? Right? And if not, why not? So sometimes you can just get unlucky, right? I will never be able to command the Starship Enterprise because of facts about faster than light travel, right? That's a bummer, but it's not something that we should be kind of concerned about politically. What if I couldn't change my job because of sectarian bars, or because I was being blackmailed, or because I was not sufficiently kind of old and distinguished to get this job? Then it begins to look more like something that we should worry about politically. And it looks like I'm not being regarded as the authoritative person over my life, and I don't have the power to change that life either. This does mean that there's going to be cases where Ben and I do disagree. For example, I think that it can be the case that you decide you want to live some, let's say, really heavily circumscribed life. So the standard example is kind of cloistered religious communities, but we can imagine similarly cloistered kind of non-religious communities. You decide to commit yourself to this life, and it's kind of procedurally independent, no one's pressured you into it, you've just decided this is what you value. And then you go and join the community. So you've decided what you value, and you're living life in accordance with that decision. And on Ben's view, you're autonomous, at least until you change your mind. On my view, you're not autonomous from the moment you join that community, because once you join the community, you're no longer powerful and you're no longer authoritative over your life. Right? And that's kind of, depending on how we set up the community, that's just going to be definitional of it. So this does produce really, at least some people think they're really weird, my intuitions have been knackered by years of working in the field, this is going to produce slightly odd-looking cases where someone decides for themselves what's valuable and lives their life in accordance with that decision, and I say they're not autonomous. Right? Which gets us into some problems that I think we might get to later on, so I'll just leave it there.
I think due to time purposes we'll make this the last ones, but it's we'll just combine these two together to say, where do you find merit in each other's views of autonomy, and why do you still prefer your account over the other's account of autonomy?
Well, can I kick off?
Yeah, go for it.
I'm going to talk partly about the type of view that James defends of autonomy is what we call the socio-relational view. It's I think, a very popular way of thinking about autonomy in the literature at the moment. I'm going to talk a little bit about the merits of that view in general, but also I guess it's useful also to talk about what I've learned and what I've gained from talking with James as a philosopher who's committed to this different view about autonomy. I think putting this central emphasis on social relations is a super important contribution, and absolutely right. I think that in the philosophy literature in general, there were sort of people who thought about this aspect of autonomy beforehand, but in a very underspecified and not very political way. I think it's been really helpful for thinking about autonomy as a whole to have the social relations that we stand in, but absolutely at the centre of the picture. And it's been very helpful for my thinking about autonomy to have James pushing that and forcing me constantly to think about it over the time that we've known each other. We can disagree about the details of how to actually make it work. There are differences about how we understand the relations concerned, different ways that we think about exactly why social relations have this effect on the autonomous life. But I really think that the socio-relational view and its defenders, that includes James, have done a fantastic job of demonstrating the limitations of the way that we thought about autonomy beforehand, what gets called the inner citadel sometimes, the idea that what makes you autonomous is just what's going on in your head. In retrospect, it now seems insane to think that, pardon my use of that phrase, because, of course, what we're after is a political concept, an idea which is part of how we interact with each other, and the idea that it might have been appropriate to think about that kind of context in the absence of any of the interconnections. I think now it just doesn't make sense in retrospect, but it's because of this fierce this fierce emphasis on the value of dependency, the importance of interconnectedness, and the significance of the social and especially political relations we stand in, that I think we've got this. So I think although in the end I disagree about some of the details, I think the tremendous contribution that James and his sort of fellow socio-relational theorists have made is to create that focus on what's social.
Thanks. Yeah, so I think, as you sort of no doubt picked up, sort of Ben and I agree, I think, probably on more than we disagree about autonomy. And certainly in terms of the robustity, was that I'm going to get you. But I think, so one thing that I think Ben's account, so I mean, I think, I used to call it procedurally independent design satisfaction. I think probably self-authorship is just the best way to call it, isn't it? Yeah. So these self-authorship type views and the kind of Rouse holds as well, I think one of the things that they get really clearly and directly is one of the things that people tend to think about autonomy, which is the importance of the life of one's own. That's what I'm going to call the kind of the authenticity requirement. The kind of surprising effect that I did to of the really heavily externalized view, the social relational view, is that in some cases it looks like what the person wants just drops out of the picture entirely. Regardless of whether or not you like the life that you're living, is just completely orthogonal to whether or not you're autonomous. Now, as it happens, I do think that's correct, but given where autonomy starts, right, given the platitudes that we used to describe it at the start, I think Benderview has the advantage of it's much more like what people tend to think about when they think about autonomy. Now that has kind of disadvantages as well, right? But if you want a view to get going, if you want a view to grip people and to be something even that might do kind of non-philosophical work, where you can go, here is a view of autonomy, here's why it matters for actual education policy or for actual housing policy. And if you don't have to spend 4 years going, let me explain to you why this is actually the correct view of autonomy, then you're onto a win, right? And the other thing is, I swither wildly about authenticity. So sometimes I just think authenticity is just chimerical, right? That there is no real self, there is no true self. We're just a sort of bundle of more or less stable experiences and views, and that the advantage of my view is that it doesn't have to say anything about that. But I'm not convinced by this, and in those moments where I think that authenticity does matter, and if I think that there is something like a real self, even if it's not kind of a metaphysically deep real self, that's when I start having worries about some of my verdicts. I mean, the other thing I think is that Ben's account looks like it's much less apt to fall into potentially worrying kind of paternalism. So this is actually really increasingly popular criticism of relational accounts of autonomy, is that because it puts the kind of locus of autonomy, or so much locus of autonomy outside the person, that it looks like your suitably wise philosopher king can go, behold, I'll now make you more autonomous by making you do loads of things that you don't want to do. I think that bullet might actually be worth biting in some cases. I also think that there are off-screen things that will militate against the relational account being really paternalist. But again, it's an argumentative burden. So I think in many ways, Ben's view is more elegant and it's more intuitive.
You asked about the reasons that we believe the views that we have, though, Nicky. Can I finish with just a couple of remarks on that front?
Absolutely.
I think I'll say two positive things about why I think my self-authorship way of thinking about autonomy. That's a metaphor which I use a lot, but which we owe to Joseph Raz, the philosopher that James was alluding to earlier on. Here are the two reasons why I think that's important. And actually, they have to do really with how the idea of autonomy fits into our broader philosophical picture. I mean, one reason that I think that I prefer my way of thinking about autonomy to James is to do with my commitment to liberalism in political philosophy more generally. I think that I'm a firm believer in a kind of value neutrality in the political realm. And I think that the way of thinking about autonomy that I avow, rather than James's, is one which both explains why neutrality might be an important thing to sustain, and also something which gives us a good principled reason to guard against people throwing around very specific and contentful value claims in politics, which I think is dangerous in various different ways. One of the reasons it's dangerous is the danger of paternalism that James was alluding to back there, but I also think that just more generally there's a kind of usurpation of the individual's authority over what counts as valuable for being made if somebody makes those value claims. The other reason that I favour my way of thinking about autonomy has to do with funnily enough, something that James also talked about earlier on, the idea of agency. I think, I as a philosopher, I'm still trying to work out what I think the correct meta-ethical view is, the right foundation for ethics in general. It's really difficult. But nevertheless, I find myself very drawn to anti-realist positions when it comes to questions in ethics. That is to say, views which are sceptical about the idea that there are moral facts about what makes our lives go well, or things of that sort that we can use to explain why the moral claims we make are true or false, or things of that sort. And one way that I can explain how that can be so, without kind of tipping over the abyss into a sort of moral nihilism, is by thinking about autonomy. I think that the self-authorship view of autonomy that I defend is the way that we model in our politics and in our interpersonal morality the fact that when it comes down to it, questions of value for the individual have to be settled just by their perspective themselves, because ultimately I'm sceptical that there's anything except for their perspective to settle those questions about what's valuable. I think there is, in some sense, nothing to these questions around what's good or a flourishing life, except these decisions that an individual makes for themselves. So it's because I've got that foundational worry about the foundations of morality that I think there's nothing to it except for a certain kind of exercise of agency of the kind that James was alluding to there, that I think in politics autonomy is the appropriate aim. And autonomy, moreover, understood in this way that puts the perspective of the individual at the heart of it. Anyway, I could go down and say more, but I'll leave that to one side.
Yeah, so I'll play with the simile straight back and just the positive things that I think about my view rather than why Ben's view's wrong. Firstly, I think one of the things that I like about the relational view is that it builds in, and I think Ashana's does this, so Marina Ashana, who I keep referring to, is I think the person who's got the best worked out and the most plausible version of the relational view. My view's fairly similar to hers. But one thing I think she could, but doesn't emphasise quite so much that's built into the relational account is the importance of equality. In particular, if you're in a society where you have the kind of power to direct your life as you see fit, but not the authority, or if you have the authority because of something morally arbitrary, like, for example, the fact that you're white, or the fact that you're rich, or the fact that you're a man, I think that puts everyone's autonomy under threat. I think there's a reflexive condition. The reason that it ought to be that you're able to direct your life is just because you're an agent, or just nothing else. And just because you're an agent, and that in itself is enough to sort of ground your having the power and authority to do so. It's a variation on the I'm not free until everyone around me is free, kind of the old anarchist slogan, right? And so that's one reason why I think, why I find the relation account more appealing, is that it builds in this sort of, as a matter of just conceptual necessity, right? And if any one person's autonomy is under threat, everyone's autonomy is under threat. And I think that seems right. It also, as Ben alludes to, it fits better with my background and political commitments. The other reason I think it's related to this is that it really does take seriously the fact that we're social beings. And now, I think that it still has a lot of room. In fact, I think in many cases it will just say the same thing as Ben's account with respect to should someone be made to do a thing that is good for their autonomy. You go, well, no, because if you're forcing someone to do these things, then in some sense you're not respecting them. If you like, the cure would be worse than the disease, even if there's some cases where it could go, yeah, theoretically, if we could make you do this, you'd be more autonomous. It will never turn out to be a good idea because you need really kind of oppressive machinery of state in order to do that sort of thing. But it takes seriously with the exception of weird edge cases, right? So kind of gerrymandered desert island type cases, and one person's acts will always impact other people, and that who we are is. I mean, I don't go quite so far as to say that kind of our entire self is just made up of our social surroundings, but I think it's really seriously influenced by it. And I don't think, I'm going to borrow Marilyn Friedman's great line here right now, we needn't join Richard Rorty in lamenting the fact that we don't create ourselves from nothing, right? And the sorts of beings that we are is necessary. We just get kind of experiences glommed onto us as we grow up. Kind of we learn to respond in certain ways, and not in certain other ways. And then we get told, right, now sort of decide what you want to do with your life. I think that really, by moving away from that, again, what's important is that people, whatever they're like, kind of however we think about their self, and that they're able to direct their lives, right? Not because there's some kind of metaphysically deep self, there's the kind of the correct view, kind of that by coming up with the correct view of autonomy, we allow that self access to kind of to making acts, but rather just we're all kind of more or less hairless apes, right? We make hairless ape kind of decisions, and so what I think should matter is that when we make those decisions, we don't cut across other people in doing so. And I think that this isn't unique to the relational account, but I think it's something the relational account does uniquely well, and it's sort of pay heed to that. I think sort of the same thing, slightly reversed from what Ben said. I think that the relational account captures some what I take to be true facts about the world in a way that allows us to make use of the notion of autonomy.
Thank you. I'm going to refrain from asking a show of hands for who supports the self. Otherwise, I might get a fight. But I think that's all we've got time for. So, can we have a massive round of applause for Ben and James? So is there anything specific which you feel that be really good to sort of clarify before we dive into the Q&A?
Sure, yeah. So one thing that you mentioned sort of right at the start about kind of internal versus external factors. So there's a sort of high-level split in the autonomy debate between what are called internalist theories and externalist theories. Internalist theories, they're the ones we can really see the if you like, the Kantian heritage, because they're very strongly concerned with reasoning in a particular way. So you have views like Frankfurt structuralism, where essentially what makes you autonomous is that you have some desire, like I want to. Well, all right, I'm not going to be able to demonstrate. I want to go and fill my cup with water, and then if that desire is endorsed at higher order level, so essentially I want to go and fill my cup with water, then you're autonomous. Right? And that, I think, gets at the idea of sort of deciding for oneself. And you can't just be a kind of random number generator, and you can't be plumping merely for options. There has to be something that says this is the decision that you make. It ends up having very, very odd results. So famously, the example of the angel in the house, Virginia Woolf's Angel in the House, and on the structuralist view, when the angel in the house is doing the washing up and suddenly realises that she's bored as hell of this and would like to get the hell out, her autonomy will become she'll become fully autonomous again only when she manages to squash that first order desire, so that desire to just kind of smash the plates and leave. The structuralist view deals really badly with cases of internalised depression. So it's not really even a purely internalist view, because it will take heed of stuff like historical factors and what's called the procedural independence views, where what matters isn't whether you do in fact endorse some particular value or some kind of particular desire that you have, but that you would be able to do so if you thought about it, and you'd be able to do so without having your reason kind of maligning influence, or what Ben sometimes calls kind of covert influences, without your reason being influenced in such a way that, for example, you would only endorse it because of internalised depression. So the procedural independence, I think, is fairly uncontroversially a precondition for more or less everyone's account of autonomy. So Ben thinks you have to be procedurally independent, I think you have to be procedurally independent. But again, because it's still ultimately a matter of getting your kind of psychological ducks lined up in a row, procedural independence. It will say that you can be autonomous if you could enforce your desires to go and play football, but as it happens, you can't follow through on that desire because you're in prison. So you get externalist views that say at least some of the work is done by factors outside the agent. So in Ben's case, whether the person actually can achieve the values that she's decided on for herself, and in my case, whether a person is in fact situated in some or other way. So both Ben and I fall on the externalist side of that split. I think most people these days, I think, probably fall. There's almost no one, I think, that's got a purely internalist view. I think structuralism is probably the only purely internalist view, and that's incredibly unpopular these days. So we're sort of we're a kind of a subdivision of a subdivision of a subdivision of autonomy, which obviously is where all the exciting fights happen.
Awesome. Open up the floor for questions. Not got any straight off the bat. I've got one, just to get everyone's brains warmed up. So you're talking about responsibility earlier, and we've had a discussion about someone's forcing you to make decisions. You're not necessarily autonomous. But I was wondering about a scenario where, let's say, someone has granted you your autonomy, and is that possible? Can someone else, if they help remove any external factors and you're internally you sort of want to make these decisions or whatever, if someone has then granted you that autonomy, are you still autonomous?
It's a good question, Jasmine. I mean, I think the short version, at least for me, is no, not really. The longer version is it depends really what's going on. So for my view, remember, to be fully autonomous, you have to be responsible for the fact that your life goes in the way that you think is valuable. And my worry about the type of intervention that you have in mind is that oftentimes those interventions might be things which sort of take away autonomy with the other hand because they undermine the responsibility that you have. That is to say, your life becomes less attributable to the choices that you make. So I worry that quite a lot of action which looks like it's supporting autonomy is in fact going to be self-defeating. Does that mean that we can't do anything to support people's autonomy? Well, no, it doesn't. But I think it means that it pushes us in general away from kind of one person or a power structure intervening specifically in somebody's life on a particular occasion, and pushes us instead towards institutional, background, structural solutions to these things. So, for example, interventions in childhood, which seem to be more effective. To my mind, it's another reason why education is really important. And maybe sort of questions to do with how the economy is structured more generally that we put in place to try and reduce the extent to which people are dependent upon particular interventions from others to uphold their autonomy. So I think that means you can, when you talk about you granting me autonomy or something of that sort, there might be things that you do which genuinely will enhance my autonomy and support me. But on the whole, I think if they're really going to work, they will either be you defending me from undue kinds of influence from other people, or they will be you designing the environment or designing the sort of the structure of our society in general in a way which facilitates my self-authorship rather than you sort of benevolently giving it to me as a kind of gift or through a direct intervention between people.
We have a question just here at the front.
Yes, it's probably quite a general one, but can someone know if they're autonomous? Because it seems like, to the extent that you're arguing, you're both looking from outside at someone and trying to work out if they're autonomous or not. Can they themselves ever actually know if they are or not? Or are they always not?
Well, I think we each have a view of autonomy from the point of view of which we can answer that question. So why don't you go first?
Yeah, thanks for the question. It's a good one as well. It's going to be impossible. I mean, unless epistemology has advanced since the last time I checked, which it may well have done. I think there's going to be some extent to which we just can't ever know for sure that we're autonomous, because there's some things that we're not going to be able to access even in principle. But I think we can have a fairly good go at knowing whether we're autonomous. If, for example, on my view, if you don't look at the social structures that you find yourself in. So, is it the case that I'm able to direct my life to the extent that I do just because I'm recognised as being an agent, as recognised as being the kind of person, the kind of being that ought to be able to take charge of their life? And looking at the world as it is, probably not, right? I mean, so the reason, or a large part of the reason I'm able to direct my life to the extent that I can, is to do with historical facts about gender and ethnicity privilege, and it's to do with some facts about I've got a fairly well-paid job, at least temporarily. So I'm sort of more autonomous than I could be, and knowably so, because I clearly am able to direct my life in certain ways. But I'm also knowably less than maximally autonomous, because I live in a society such that just being an agent isn't a good enough reason for people to be enabled, not allowed, but enabled, to pursue their self-direction. Of course, it could be the case that there's a kind of a complicated Truman Show story going on, where actually kind of every time I think I've made a decision for myself, or I've caused something to happen by my own actions, someone's got there and done it ahead of me. But that kind of radical scepticism aside, I think it's certainly possible for people to have a fairly good crack at knowing whether or not they're autonomous. But I do also think people can just flatly be wrong about their autonomous status. And for I suppose this will probably become clearer when you give your answer.
Well, I agree with that. So I also think people can be wrong about whether or not they have a life that's autonomous. I think it's partly one of the reasons for that is that whether or not you're autonomous for me depends on at least some things that won't be transparent to you. you're not autonomous if you're being manipulated behind your back in a certain kind of way, on my view. But of course, by definition, you might well think that you're not being manipulated, but in fact are. So to the extent that you're vulnerable to that kind of manipulation, I think you won't know about it. I also think that the question of whether or not you are responsible for the way that your life, for the success or otherwise of your life according to your rights, is something which you might not be able to know about because it's a very complicated matter. I think that that's a strength of the view, it's not a weakness of the view. Because I think it captures something, I sort of touched upon this, it's really difficult to get this idea to come out properly, but let me have a go. It captures something important about the way of thinking about autonomy that I think is right, which is that in a certain sense, although we care about it tremendously, it's a value or a consideration which is sort of unintelligible from the first person point of view. So suppose that you go back to my jingle, so if you're autonomous, if you decide for yourself what is valuable and live your life in accordance with that decision. Suppose you have somebody who really sort of cares about autonomy in that sense, and you say, well, okay, what are you going to do with your life? And they say, oh, well, I'm going to decide for myself what is valuable and live my life in accordance with that decision. And you say, okay, but what are you actually going to do? They say, I'm going to decide for myself what is valuable and live my life in accordance with that decision. It's a kind of empty life. Because the heart of the value that's being posited is somebody wholeheartedly and enthusiastically focusing on something other than autonomy, that they sort of make the activities that they pursue. I think that's what I meant earlier on when I talked a little bit about the idea of autonomy as this kind of third-person footprint that the value of a life from the first-person perspective has in politics. I think, in other words, that there's a sense in which autonomy is just is correctly unintelligible from the first-person point of view. It's not the thing you should be aiming at. It's not really the aspect under which your own life ever appears valuable to you, at least not in a kind of central way, not by itself. And I think that the sort of the epistemic opacity of it, the fact that you don't get to know authoritatively whether or not you live autonomously, is just a consequence of that fact, that really your autonomy is ultimately a consideration for your political community. It's a fact about how other people ought to treat you, not a feature of your internal life yourself. And if you think that all of that fits together in the way that I've just sketched, then you would expect, in fact, that the individual doesn't have particular privileged standing when it comes to working out whether or not they're autonomous. Because why would they, if all of the rest of it works in the way that I've described?
Great. I think we had a follow-up question just jumping on that.
Yeah, I'm not a philosophy person, so I might use some wrong terms. But in terms of people not knowing whether they're autonomous and perhaps thinking that they are, like in cases of people with like dementia and Alzheimer's, like Dorfman has his whole patient Margot, I think her name is, thing. And what do you think about that, about people who think they're autonomous but are not, but then are doing stuff in accordance with how they want to live their lives, like doing like painting that they enjoy, but other people aren't viewing that as an autonomous lifestyle?
Could I take that one, James, since I'm going around dementia a lot at the moment? It's a really good case. I think that, the first thing to say is that people can be mistaken about whether or not they're autonomous. Indeed, people can be mistaken even about whether they satisfy just those internal conditions. But actually, you ask a brilliant question, because I think it raises the way that it's possible for a sort of chauvinism to creep into the way that we talk about autonomy. That is to say, I think often we imagine the acme of the autonomous agent being a sort of roughly neurotypical human adult who has the kinds of capacities and whose mentality works in the sort of way that sort of your sort of stereotypical competent adult agent does. And I call that chauvinism because I think that it's guilty of a kind of limited perspective. All of the research that I've done into autonomy and mental disorder, autonomy in the context of neuroatypicality and degenerative cognitive conditions like Alzheimer's and dementia, suggests actually that there are quite a lot of significant ways in which people with whose minds work in those different ways actually do satisfy lots of conditions of autonomy, that people in those conditions can lead lives where there's an intelligible sense in which they're deciding for themselves what is valuable, there's an intelligible sense in which they are using their environment as best they can to shape their life in the way that matches that. And I think we do something wrong if we automatically exclude that type of life as not being autonomous, because it doesn't live up to our conception of what mental competency is. So I kind of alluded rather dismissively earlier on to Beauchamp and Childress, the sort of the doyens of medical ethics who use this word autonomy. Well, according to them, by definition, somebody who has any mental disorder cannot be autonomous. It just strikes me as wildly inappropriate in different ways. We have somebody that both James and I taught, I think, now lecturer down in Bristol, in Brighton, called Elliot Porter. Elliot's work is on mental disorder and autonomy, and has been done very interesting, sort of almost ethnographic research, looking at the detailed first-person accounts of different kinds of mental disorder. He's focused especially so far on mood disorders like bipolar, for example. And when you actually get into the weeds of thinking about these things from the first-person perspective, you find these very different ways to be autonomous that don't immediately come to mind when I'm thinking about it from the perspective of the kind of mind that I have, for example. So I think there's a lot more autonomy in those contexts than you might think to begin with. It's understandable that people miss it, especially people who have known a person through a process of cognitive decline or change. Because, of course, what you focus on is that they're not the autonomous person that they were when you knew them 10 or 20 years ago. But nevertheless, I think we can do a lot to recognise and uphold the autonomy that somebody, even with very sort of changed mental capacities, has later on in their life.
Wonderful. I think the next question is just
Yeah, thank you. My question is for James specifically. I just want to make sure I understand the mechanics of an answer that you gave in the first section. So you were saying, like, obviously, relations are obviously central to your conception of autonomy, and it was something about, apart from gerrymandered desert island cases, blah, 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 right? So just so that I think I know where you're going with it, but just to kind of like expand a tiny bit on that, and the actual question would be something like, so is it the case that, like, your view, like, you might even be willing to bite the bullet that in a desert island kind of case, if I understand it correctly, your view might even be silent, let's say, but because this is almost never happening in the real actual world, or because we are social beings, blah, 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 this is why your view kind of like has something to say.
Good. Yeah, thanks for the question. And yeah, so I sort of just reached for the well of things that I assume everyone will know. Of course, I'm an incredibly narrow discipline, so why would I think that? Yeah. And so when I talk about gerrymandered desert island cases, I'm talking about some sort of notional case where you take your standard competent adult human and you kind of drop them on a desert island, and then you go, can they be autonomous? Right? Now, as it happens, I'm sort of tempted to say my view is silent. I think actually my view will say, no, you really can be autonomous, or lack thereof, on a desert island, in a desert island case where you're the only person. But it will be an edge case in that it's not very, very likely. It will also be in some senses uninteresting from the point of view of autonomy in kind of political philosophy and politics, because just as you say, most of us aren't in that sort of position, at least most of the time. So I think I can never remember, I quoted saying this all of the time, but I can never find the flippant page. Alison Jagger's got a quote that goes something like, internalist views, or views that sort of take desert island cases to be the default, they assume that logically, if not sociologically, humans are atomistic. Right? That it makes sense, kind of logically, to think of someone as never having interactions with other people, but still being kind of recognisably human. And of course, empirically, that's just not true. Right? If you sort of have someone who's not raised by humans and in close contact with humans for the first kind of 10, 15 years of their life, as far as I know, they can acquire language after that. Right? And they're clearly missing something that is standardly important for most people in society. So yeah, if we start from the position that the default for humans is to be surrounded by other people, then I think that's an appropriate one, just in terms of looking at politics. Right? My view will still say, yeah, you can be notionally autonomous on a desert island. If you're not, so you might, for example, you might lack the power to do certain things on a desert island. That's the sort of point where I go, to use the incredibly technical term, that's a bummer, but that's not a political problem. Right? That's just malfortune. Right? That's the world kind of not lining up the way we want it to. And I mean, you know, the human condition, right? Like lots of our life is a bummer. And what we should be concerned about insofar as we're doing politics is we should be concerned about social structures. We should be concerned about how we interact with other people. So yeah, the relational view, I think, can say things about desert island cases, but will say if it looks odd on a desert island case, that's fine because desert island cases are weird.
For the next couple of questions, because everyone sat very close to each other, if I know your name, I will use it. I apologise if I don't. Margot, go ahead.
Are we more or less autonomous the more choices that we are given to make?
Good. I realise this is an incredibly unsatisfying answer, but I think it's true. It depends. Right? On the whole, I think one way I could try and sneak around this is by saying actually what you're talking about is the scope of autonomy, and the scope of autonomy isn't the same thing as how autonomous you are, which I think might be right, but it's also kind of a get out, right? So I'll try and give you a more sort of satisfactory answer. I think that if famously just being given more choices isn't always a good thing. So who's got the gas station night clerk example? Is it Kwon? Was it talking? I don't know. Right. Someone who I should know, and there's one example who said, look, it's clearly not the case that more choices is always better, because he says, imagine that you're working in a petrol station on the night shift, and someone comes in and they pull out a sawn off and they say, right, open the safe. Now, if you don't know the code, you've got fewer choices open to you, right? You can only say, I don't know what it is. I suppose also, we have to assume that in this case, the person with the shotgun can tell whether or not they're telling the truth, right? Philosophers have arranged it that this person with the shotgun can tell whether or not he's telling the truth. If, on the other hand, you do know the code, then you've got more choices to make, right? You can decide to open the safe, or you can decide not to and risk getting your head blown off. That doesn't look like it's good for you. It doesn't look like it's kind of increased your autonomy, particularly in any way. Right? It just looks like it's a choice that you'd rather not have been presented with. So these are sometimes called coercive offers, right? Where you offer me, let's say you say, I'll give you £10 to kick that cat. Right, and I want a tenner, right? Let's make it kind of more plausible. If you kick that cat across the room, I'll make sure that your daughter never goes hungry, right? Now, I definitely want my daughter never to go hungry, right? But, like in that case, Tiddles is going across the room. But I would rather not have been presented with that choice, right? I'd rather simply, it was the case that Kira never went hungry, regardless of whether or not I abuse cats. So I think it will depend really significantly on the nature of the choice. But it's certainly not just sort of generally true that more choices is good for autonomy. It will often be the case that having more kind of realistic options is better for your autonomy. So Ashana builds in kind of access to a range of relevant options. And that clearly gets something intuitive, right? If you never get to make any choices, it seems bizarre to say that you can be autonomous. But it will be heavily dependent on the nature of the choices being made. So I think on the whole, if you've got more genuine options, so if you have kind of options A through C and they're all good, then adding another good option looks like it's good for your autonomy. And if you've got options A and B and then C would have some good effects, but would have some really serious kind of bad effects as well, it's not clear whether just adding that choice is good for your autonomy.
There's also just the question, even with sort of morally neutral options, whether you're in a position to be able to make use of them to pursue your autonomy. If I give you an extra choice, you have to know about it, you have to be able to distinguish it from the options you already have. I think that's what sort of James, I'm referring to the same idea there as James's point, that they have to be distinct and distinctly valuable. There might be some extra options that we could in principle give you where it's no use to you because the epistemic burden you bear to make use of it is just too high. If you've got 10 toasters you can choose between to buy, that's probably enough. It's not clear that life is any better if you have 100 toasters. Because either you have to spend all of your time reading about toasters, it's probably not very exciting, or you just end up having to plump, in which case the extra options didn't really do any good for you. So yeah, it's one of those things that's really frustrating about libertarians or liberals who focus just on negative liberty, the absence of external constraint, though that's very important a lot of the time, but it's kind of missing the point that the value of negative liberty, the value of having options, is really just because it has this contingent supportive function for autonomy rather than because it's the thing we're actually aiming at.
The next question, Nicky, is just here.
Well, the basic idea that one should see liberalism as a political theory committed to the idea of autonomy. Are there other values that you might consider?
Well, I think, so it's important to note here that, so I'm a liberal. James is definitely not a liberal, but of course that might still mean that James is committed to ideas about what liberalism is committed to. I think that there are three options, basically. So one option is that you understand liberalism as being the political philosophy that is committed to autonomy, understood somehow or other. Another option is that you understand liberalism as being the position that's committed to the value of negative liberty. Classic liberalism, the sort of person who favours the free market, for example, or stuff of that sort. And then I think the third option that you find in the literature really is the person who thinks that liberalism is characterised by being committed to absolutely nothing at all. That what makes liberalism distinctive as a political philosophy is that you don't have to believe anything in particular about what's valuable at the foundations in order to accept liberalism as the appropriate political philosophy to have. Now, I think the second is unattractive for reasons that came up in response to the last question. And I think the third is actually incoherent when you look into the details, because it turns out that, well, I shouldn't say this as though it's established fact. I have argued that and believe firmly that actually you can't get an argument from any of the sort of things that people might say about that kind of value neutrality, get an argument from that to determine the political order, unless you sneak in autonomy through the back door. So it's only if you think that autonomy is in some sense valuable that you're going to think that the type of disagreement over fundamental questions of value implies a liberal order, for reasons I alluded to earlier on in the main part of the talk, actually. But nevertheless, I think those are the three options you have. You get liberals who believe in autonomy, probably tend to be more at the kind of social liberal end of the spectrum. You get liberals who believe fundamentally in liberty. They tend to be at the sort of the classic right-wing end of the liberal spectrum. And then you get the Rawlsians who believe in neutrality, who, well, goodness knows what else they believe. But they don't have as much of, they don't feature in politics so much.
Thank you. There is the fourth position, which is that the liberal is the person who's committed to private property. And I think that might give you something like the Rawlsian position as well. Because the most he ever goes is market socialism, which I think is consistent with private property.
That's true. That's true. You could, and I guess that's, I mean, in a sense, that's the sort of thing that a Marxist would say, is that... sorry.
that was not the thing that a Marxist would say, yeah.
This talk about values, the kind of answer that I've just given to Kayed there is, that's the kind of epiphenomenal froth that you get at the front of it, but actually what characterises liberalism is a commitment to a certain type of economic order, with this sort of veneer that apparently vindicates it. And I think if you thought that, then yes, absolutely. Commitment to one of the sort of very inequitable features of our current economic structure might be the thing that characterises liberals. Of course, since I'm both a liberal, as I think of it, and also somebody who believes that markets are terrible, and that we need to have some other way of organising our economic activity, I would find that a very uncomfortable conclusion. But
would you find that a contradiction, in fact?
I think I would. Yeah.
The next question is just
yeah, so you both kind of alluded to earlier about the danger of paternalism, and I think that obviously there's instances where paternalism will kind of impact upon autonomy, assuming you want to remain within the confines of the law. But I was wondering, would you kind of consider a libertarian paternalism or a nudging, as it's known? Would you say that could be consistent with remaining autonomous, or is it still a danger?
So I've got a possibly slightly surprising view on this, which is, despite the fact that nudging puts my hackles up intensely, I think, yeah, nudging is actually consistent with being autonomous. Nudging is, or libertarian paternalism, is the idea that you you encourage people to do the things that are good for them, usually understood in a fairly kind of creative welfare explain, not by making them do it, and not by giving them really persuasive arguments, but by kind of circumventing their reason. Right? So it's not irrational, it's rather it's an irrational approach. So the classic example is you put booze and pornography and cigarettes on the top shelves because they're more physically distant. And you can see what I was saying earlier about us being headless apes. This does have a noticeable effect on whether people go for things, just literally, is it closer, right? Also, it gets out of our eye line and so on and so forth. Or when they put kind of their healthy foods in the canteen kind of closest within reach. Now, there are some cases where it does just make sense, like you have a reason to go for the thing which is closest to hand. Like if you're just in a rush and you go, here's 6 equally good options, that one's closest, fine. Right? That's not in itself irrational, because what you've done there is gone, I have a specific reason to get the thing that's closest to hand. When it's not even supposed to work, it just doesn't occur to you. And you're contemplating these various things, and you go, oh yeah, because we have adjacency bias, right? Because that's just a thing that plagues our reason. So the idea behind nudging is you change the choice architecture right now. You make it such that if we don't engage our brains, we're going to go for the healthy option. Now, although it gets right on my wick, I don't think it's necessarily a threat to autonomy. Just for a really, really straightforward reason, everything's got to be arranged some way or other. Right? If we've got kind of less healthy and more healthy foods, we have to arrange them somehow. I think it would be a very classical liberal approach if you just went, well, let's get one unhealthy thing, one healthy thing, one unhealthy, right? Given that we've got to arrange things some way or other, you might as well put the healthy stuff at the front, is my thinking. Where I'm concerned about nudging is I think it's sort of you go back a step and then go, well, who is it that's doing the nudging, right? And in particular, what control over them do we have? What mechanisms of accountability do we have for kind of making sure that, firstly, that we can stop them if we want to, and secondly, that they are in fact going for the healthy things and not the things that will happen to be made by the company that recently gave a large donation to the government, right? And that, I think, is where I worry about autonomy. And I think that's not really a nudging concern at all. Like, nudging is one version of a broader concern about domination. Right? I'm sort of worried about people, organisations, sort of corporate bodies being able to interfere arbitrarily in our lives without us being able to have a kind of roughly a good chance of beating them back if we wanted to. And so nudging kind of directly, like it makes me different, but I think it's not necessarily a threat to autonomy, but the mechanisms by which we lack or have control over the nudges are, I think, what kind of matters. I think it's a good question.
Francis? It's from your bed. So I just want a bit more clarification on the place that you place on relations, because you do acknowledge them. But it seems to me that certain members of populations we were talking about before, that these people, social relations, like their ability to decide for themselves what is valuable in their life and according to that decision really seems to be heavily contingent on the relations that they live in. So I feel like part of your answer might be in response to Jasmine, but why you acknowledge that, but it's not a central focus of your account.
So it has one of the distinctions here is that's useful to draw is between thinking that social relations are causally important for the autonomous life and thinking that they're constitutive of the autonomous life. So I think that they are tremendously important causally. That is, there may be lots of people who, given their capacities and the types of things they want to do, that just as a matter of means and ends, you can't do it without the social arrangements being around you in a certain way. I think, as you say, people who suffer certain kinds of vulnerability or impaired capacity, that will be particularly so poor. But I think it's true of all of us. I mean, none of us is, I think, capable of achieving the complicated, interesting things we want to do without help from other people, without other people not thwarting us. But of course, all of that is not telling us anything about what autonomy is, it's just telling us about how to get it. And that's the distinction. I think that autonomy, these things matter tremendously as means to achieving autonomy, but what autonomy means is the individual having this particular kind of relationship with their life that I sketched earlier on, that they decide for themselves what's valuable and live their lives in accordance with that decision. That's a kind of important point of difference between me and James, because James would agree with everything that I've said so far about the cause and importance of social relations. But in addition, he would say, no, look, I mean, you haven't understood what autonomy is if you think that you can tell me what an autonomous life is without specifying that there have to be the relations present that uphold your power and authority over your life, that don't undermine those things. Of course, it gets even more complicated than that. I think the way that the debate often goes in this type of area, I think the arguments that we often have will consist in the advocate of the socio-relational view saying, but look, here, this feels like a way in which social relations matter to autonomy, which you can't capture by just saying that they're merely causally important. And then I come along and sort of dance as complicatedly as I can to try and show how I can incorporate the intuition that that type of social relation matters. So there are other things that one can bring in. I've talked a bit about how important I think responsibility is for the individually autonomous life. I think that there are multiple different possible notions of responsibility that might matter here, and I think at least some of them are socialised. That is to say, I think what it means to be responsible in at least some ways is a matter of social relations that you stand in, being held to account or being upheld by your co-citizens or something of that sort. So if you think that's the case, then you're going to think that this thing that I believe is necessary for autonomy, namely standing in these responsibility relations, ultimately beds out in some social relations that you have to stand in. But again, I think the key distinction here is that that's something that turns out to be an implication of the view of autonomy given our background theory and how we understand responsibility. It's not part of the core of what the ideal is. Whereas for James, I think the question of which social relations you stand in is just at the heart of what it means to have a life that you govern for yourself. So that's where that's where I stand on that, Francis.
Nicky?
Thank you. So I read a paper that was arguing that advertising is like harmful or unethical based on what it does to autonomy, by basically over promoting, sex, wealth and power. You don't have access to as many different conceptions of life. Now, this might presuppose a kind of self-authorship view of autonomy, but with that in mind, do you think there's any aspects of Western society that kind of infringe upon autonomy? Sorry. Just one, if you can think of just one. But yeah, no, if there's any aspects that infringe on our autonomy in a kind of maybe indirect way that people maybe wouldn't realise?
So if I wanted to take the advertising one head on, so I think we can say some interesting things about that. Now, one of the obvious ways is just in a kind of I use a bad word there, it messes up procedural independence, right? And we're taught to think of ourselves as only being valuable if X or Y or Z, right? Like X is some sufficiently high number of patterns. But I think if you take the relational view, I think one of the interesting consequences there, it will turn out that actually just having these kinds of adverts, right, like just being in society such that, because the adverts wouldn't say, look, if you drink this beer, you'll be much richer, and if we didn't socially care about being wealthy, right, like if wealth wasn't actually a thing that mattered, a thing that really did heavily determine how much control you can have over your life. So I think the sort of adverts kind of actually in the same way that I feel about nudging, despite the fact that a lot of these adverts make me violently angry. And I'm inclined to think that the real damage has already been done, right? Which is not to say that, of course, that adverts can't have psychologically damaging effects. I mean, you look at the kind of statistics on gambling problems, right, and you compare it to the number of bookies ads that you'll see during any sporting event, right? And certainly not to deny that they do have this causal psychological effect. But I think the adverts, if you like, they're the tip of the iceberg, right? They're the thing that we can see and point at and go, oh, this is really messed up. But the fact that these adverts exist, the fact that it does matter how wealthy you are, how good looking you are, or whether or not you're a manly man, right? is something that points to the fact that we already live in a society that doesn't make us autonomous, and in fact goes significantly out of its way to render lots of people heteronymous in order to maximise profit and power for a very small number of people. And I'll leave it there.
Can I answer your question as well?
By all means.
I alluded to this earlier on, but I'll say it now a little bit more forthrightly. I think the market mechanism systematically undermines our autonomy, especially in the context of unequal material wealth. And the reason for that is that the way that the price mechanism works in a free market is that the amount of resources you have to give up to acquire the stuff that you want to pursue your ambitions is settled by other people's choices and other people's decisions within the market. I think that this represents a kind of systemic domination, basically. I think there's a core of it which could be defensible in a very, very distant possible world, the idea that the real cost of the resources you want is the opportunity foregone by other people and you being able to consume it for yourself. But to the extent that we have a real embodied market in a context where people come into that market with massively unequal bidding power, then I think that it makes it almost impossible for lots of the responsibility conditions of autonomy, in my view, to be met. Because here's one way of determining whether you meet that condition, is to ask, well, what's the explanation for the way that your life goes, and to what extent is it the exercise of your individual agency that is the explanation of how your life goes. And if all of the material circumstances of your life are settled by the fact that, for example, fantastically wealthy people choose to consume products in a way which raises the price of X up to a certain level, you have to adapt your preferences, tailor your activities in light of that. Well, all of that type of explanation, that is to say, almost all explanation of what people do when a free market is the way that we allocate our consumption and production resources, all of that takes it out of your hands completely. I don't know what we do instead, I should say. I mean, I've been thinking about this for a long time. Well, okay, so getting into the question about sort of, whether we can come up with a sensible alternative economic calculus, I think, is maybe a debate for another time next term.
I'll be the next panel.
But I don't think you have to have an alternative in hand to say this is really a terrible state of affairs for autonomy. Thank you.
We are coming up to the end of the time that we have. Anyone has any last minute questions? No? If not, then I think we'll end it here. Well, thank you very much all for joining us today. It was a really, really interesting event, if I do say so myself. A bit of a shameless plug before we let you leave. Please do follow us on social media. On Instagram, Facebook, you can find us at Potsuti. We post regular episodes during term time. We have a really good episode out if you'd like to listen to more on authority and autonomy with James Humphries, and one on autonomy and end of life care with Ben Colburn. Please do feel free to join us at Cooper's on Great Western Road for a pint or two from 5 PM, and thank you very much.